There were reenactments and commemoration events in 4 historic locations outside Dublin. Ceremonies were held in Cork City, Enniscorthy, Athenry and Ashbourne.
While the volunteers were fighting a losing battle in Dublin, Ashbourne in County Meath saw the only rebel victory Easter week. Today, hundreds gathered to watch a reenactment. History was played out before them as 50 men, led by Thomas Ashe and Richard Mulcahy, attacked the local RIC station and ambushed police. When it was all over, 2 volunteers and 9 policemen were dead. Afterwards, the state commemoration began. A poem written by Thomas Ashe was read to the crowd.
Let me carry your cross for Ireland, Lord. Let me suffer the pain and shame.
For his relatives, today had a special meaning.
He was very much entwined into the community here in the local area, as well as these humble beginnings back in Kerry. But yes, it's a very emotional day for the family, and I'm sure for all the families associated with the people that were involved in the Battle of Ashbourne.
At exactly 1:15, 2 wreaths were laid at the memorial at Rathcross, where fighting began 100 years ago. A minute's silence was held before the last post was sounded.
The day of commemorative events in Enniscorthy, County Wexford, started with a special mass at St Aidan's Cathedral. Relatives of those who took part in the rising here gathered outside.
My grandfather, Patsy O'Farrell, was involved here in that name during 1916, and he also had fighting down in Irish Street in Keegan's house down there.
Enniscorthy was the largest mobilisation of volunteer forces in 1916 outside of Dublin, so it was a huge stronghold, and it was the last centre to actually surrender on the 1st of May in 1916.
In all, over 1,000 people took part in the parade, and thousands looked on as pikemen and women marched along with soldiers from the 3rd Battalion South.
Having organised and trained her manhood.
After the proclamation was read, wreaths were laid by local and national politicians. The flag was raised and an Air Corps flypast took place.
After the official state ceremonies concluded, there was a 1916 battle reenactment.
The reenactment entertained the crowds, with organisers saying today's commemorative events went off perfectly.
The historic medieval town of Athenry was one of the key areas outside of Dublin to rise up in Easter 1916. A huge sense of occasion and being part of history for the thousands of people gathered here today commemorating 1916 through music, poetry and dance. Athenry led the way in a parade representing every GAA club in the county of Galway, Parad Phobal na Gaillimhe. Athenry is steeped in the history of 1916. This is where more than 2,000 volunteers were formally set up, and it's where the young IRB Republican Liam Mellows was dispatched to drill and train the men.
Liam Mellows arrived and said to them, lads, leave down the hurls, we have to take up the guns and fight for Irish freedom.
My grandfather, Pat Monaghan, was a volunteer, and 2 granduncles, John Rooney and Martin Rooney from Rockfield outside Athenry. And also my granduncle, Father Tom Fay, was involved in calling on Mellows to disband.
Labour's Jan O'Sullivan laid the wreath in a synchronised ceremony with other venues around the country.
Athenry was undoubtedly the hotbed of the volunteers outside of Dublin City itself.
Ultimately, the rebels were forced to disband. But today, every man and woman who played a part in the struggle for independence in the West are being honoured.
Over 5,000 people gathered in Cork City Centre for today's state wreath-laying ceremony to mark the centenary of the 1916 Easter Rising. 1,000 Cork volunteers from villages and towns across the county were mobilised on Easter Sunday 1916, but orders and counter-orders from Dublin led only to confusion.
The failure of the Cork Brigade to mobilise in Easter 1916, without a shadow of a doubt, was influential in making Cork, in many respects, the cockpit of revolution. during the War of Independence that followed.
Their mobilisation was commemorated today by the unveiling of plaques at Cork's County Hall and at the former headquarters of the Volunteers on Shear Street in Cork City Centre.
They were bitterly disappointed they didn't support the uprising in Dublin, but they really didn't know what was happening. So, you know, it's a great day to have the Cork City recognise, as I said, not just my grandfather, but the people who stood with him.
The first band of the Southern Brigade entertained the thousands who gathered at the city's National Monument for a ceremony which included the reading of the proclamation and the laying of commemorative wreaths by the Acting Minister for Defence, the county's mayor and the city's Lord Mayor, before an army bugler sounded Reveille.